On the eve of his hanging, when the jailhouse had gone quiet and even the guards spoke in low, respectful tones, Elias Crow sat alone on the narrow cot with his hands resting loose in his chains, listening to the wind as it slid through the gallows outside like a living thing, whispering against the beams that would carry his weight come morning. And it was then, with the lantern light trembling on the stone walls and the long night stretching ahead like an unmarked grave, that he began to speak, not to the walls, nor to God, whom he was no longer sure listened, but to the memory of a truth he had buried so deep it had shaped his legend without ever showing its face. He spoke softly, as though the wind itself might carry his words beyond the bars, back across the plains and into the past where everything had first gone wrong, confessing that he had not always been the man they would hang at dawn, not always the cold-eyed outlaw whispered about in saloons and feared on lonely roads. But once a boy with a steady hand and a quiet heart, raised on a stretch of land where the grass bent kindly and the sky felt close enough to touch, a place he had shared with a woman named Clara Bell, whose laughter had been as gentle as rain and whose eyes held the kind of patience that could tame even the wildest part of a man, and it was for her, he admitted, that he had taken his first step into darkness, though no one had ever known it. The stories said he'd killed for gold, for pride, for the thrill of it, but Elias whispered that the first blood laid at his feet had been spilled because he loved someone too deeply to let her be taken by a world that offered her no mercy, a world where a powerful rancher with clean boots and dirty intentions had decided she belonged to him, and when Elias had stood in his way, standing thin and unarmed beneath a hard sun, that man had laughed and sent others to teach him his place, and Elias had learned then that goodness without strength was just another word for helpless, so he had gone looking for strength wherever the West hid it, even if it came wrapped in sin. He told how the first gun he ever held had felt heavier than it should, not because of its weight but because of the choice it represented, and how the first time he fired it, his hands had shaken so badly he'd been sick afterward, though no one had seen, because legends are built on what people believe, not on what is true. As the night deepened and the wind grew colder, he confessed that each crime that followed had been another stone laid over the truth, each robbery, each reckless ride into danger a way of keeping the world focused on the monster instead of the man, because if they ever looked too closely, they might see that every violent act traced back to a single, desperate promise he had made to Clara Bell the night she cried in his arms and asked him not to let them break her, a promise he had kept at the cost of his soul. He spoke of the way she had waited for him through the early years, hiding her fear behind brave smiles, believing he would find a way back to the light, and how he had believed it too until the distance between who he was and who he had become grew so wide it felt impossible to cross, and when she finally left, not because she stopped loving him but because loving him had become a slow kind of death, he had let the world believe her gone by his hand, a rumor he never denied because it was easier than admitting she had chosen life without him. Elias admitted that this was the secret no one ever knew, that the outlaw they cursed had been shaped not by hunger for violence but by a quiet, enduring love twisted by fear and circumstance, and that the blood-soaked legend had grown because he never once corrected the lie, letting the darkness wear his name like a coat, until even he could no longer remember how to take it off. The lantern flickered as he spoke of nights on the run when he would wake from dreams of her standing in a doorway filled with light, saying nothing, just watching him with an expression that hurt worse than anger, and how each morning after those dreams he would ride harder, faster, as if distance could outrun memory. He confessed that some of the men he'd been said to kill had lived, left groaning but breathing in the dust, because even at his worst he had drawn lines he would not cross, lines the stories erased because mercy does not make for frightening legends, and he admitted that he had surrendered not because he was caught, but because he was tired of carrying a story that no longer belonged to him, tired of being remembered as something he never truly was. As the gallows creaked softly outside, he leaned back against the cold stone and whispered that if Clara Bell ever heard of his end, he hoped she would understand why he never came after her, why he chose to become the villain so she could remain untouched by the shadow that followed him, and that this confession, spoken to no one and everyone all at once, was his last attempt to set something right. Even if the rope would still take him at sunrise, he spoke until his voice grew hoarse, until the night felt thinner, as if dawn were already pressing its pale fingers against the horizon, and in those final hours he allowed himself to feel everything he had denied, the fear, the regret, the lingering hope that somewhere beyond the judgment of men, truth still mattered, and when at last he fell silent, the wind carried his words through the gallows and out across the sleeping town, across the plains and into the long memory of the West, where legends are born not from lies alone, but from the confessions no one ever hears. They first saw her at midday, when the sun stood high and merciless over Red Mesa and the heat pressed down on the town like a held breath, riding in alone on a dust-colored horse with her black veil pinned neatly beneath a wide hat, her posture straight despite the long miles behind her, and though no one spoke her name out loud, every man who watched from shaded porches and open doorways knew it already. Elena Marrow, the widow whose past trailed her like a shadow that never shortened, the woman whispered about in saloons and warned against in half-serious tones, because they said that every outlaw she had ever loved had met a violent end, shot down in the dirt or dragged from the saddle too late to be saved, and whether it was curse or coincidence, no one in Red Mesa was eager to find out. She rented the small adobe house at the edge of town where the land began to break open into red stone and scrub, a place long empty and avoided, and she moved through her days quietly, buying only what she needed, speaking little, her voice low and steady when she did, and though her beauty was undeniable, dark hair streaked faintly with silver, eyes the color of storm clouds over sand, there was something heavier about her, a sadness worn with dignity, like mourning clothes she never fully removed. At night, when lanterns glowed and music drifted from the saloon, she stayed home, sitting near the window with a book she rarely seemed to read, listening instead to the wind that crossed the mesa and carried memories she did not speak of, and if she noticed the way men looked at her with curiosity mixed with fear, she gave no sign, because she had learned long ago that attention was not the same as safety. It was 3 weeks after her arrival, on an evening when the sky burned orange and purple and the air smelled faintly of rain that never came, that fate stepped across her threshold in the form of a man bleeding into the dust, collapsing just short of her door as if he had chosen the place without knowing why, and when Elena heard the dull thud and opened the door to find him there, a gunslinger by the look of him, tall and lean, his coat torn, his breath shallow, a dark stain spreading beneath his ribs, she did not scream or call for help, though she could feel the old fear stirring, the familiar tightening in her chest that whispered warnings she knew too well. Instead, she knelt beside him, seeing not the danger others would see but the fragile truth beneath it, the way his hand twitched as if still reaching for something, the way his eyes fluttered open just long enough to meet hers with a flicker of surprise and relief, and she dragged him inside with more strength than she knew she had, bolting the door behind them as the sun slipped below the horizon and the town of Red Mesa carried on unaware. His name, she would learn later, was Jonah Cade, a man with a reputation that followed him almost as closely as hers followed her, a gunslinger who had walked the thin line between hired gun and hunted man, known for his skill but also for the strange restraint he showed in a land that rarely rewarded it, and as Elena worked through the night to clean and bind his wound, her hands steady despite the memories rising unbidden, other nights, other men, the smell of blood and dust and the awful stillness that came after, she told herself this was different, that she was only doing what decency required, that she would send him on his way once he healed, but even then, with the lamp casting soft light over his pale face, she felt the faint, dangerous stirring of something she had sworn never to allow again. Jonah drifted in and out of fevered sleep, murmuring names she did not recognize, his brow creased with pain and regret, and once, near dawn, his hand found hers and held on with surprising gentleness, as if he were afraid she might disappear, and Elena sat there, listening to his breathing, wondering when exactly she had become a woman fate kept testing, offering her the same story dressed in different faces. Days passed, slow and heavy with unspoken tension, as Jonah healed under her roof, the two of them moving around each other with careful politeness, sharing meals and silences in equal measure, and though he noticed the way townsfolk looked at her when he accompanied her into Red Mesa for supplies, the way conversation stilled and eyes followed, he did not ask at first. Perhaps sensing that some truths could not be rushed, and Elena, for her part, saw the way he carried himself, alert even when resting, the way his gaze softened when he looked at her, not with hunger but with gratitude edged by something deeper, something that frightened her more than anger ever could. One evening, as the heat finally broke and a cool breeze swept down from the mesa, Jonah spoke her name with a care that made her heart ache, telling her he owed her his life, that he would not forget what she had done, and she answered honestly that saving him did not mean she wanted him to stay, because staying had a way of costing people more than they expected, and when he asked then, gently, what the town feared about her, she turned toward the window, watching the sky darken, and said only that men who loved her did not live long, that the West had a way of taking what it envied, and Jonah did not laugh or dismiss it, did not challenge the belief or romanticize it, but nodded as if he understood too well how stories grew roots in hard ground. Still, despite her warnings and his better judgment, something fragile and undeniable began to grow between them. woven out of shared glances and quiet conversations, of evenings spent listening to the wind and mornings filled with cautious hope, and Red Messer watched from a distance, uneasy and curious, because the widow's door no longer closed so tightly against the world and the gunslinger who should have ridden on had not, and whispers began to spread like dry grass catching fire, whispers that reached the wrong ears, stirring old enemies and debts Jonah had thought buried. Elena felt the shift before it showed itself, the tightening of the air, the way Jonah's posture grew more guarded, and though she did not yet know what fate was preparing, she knew the pattern too well to mistake it, and as the sun set one night in a blaze of red that mirrored the stone beyond her home, she stood beside Jonah in the doorway, feeling the dangerous pull of love and dread entwined, wondering not if tragedy would come, but whether this time she would survive it when it did. Deadwood Crossing had forgotten what law looked like long before the day Silas Boone rode in beneath a sky the color of old steel. The town slumped low and tired between dry hills like it had given up on being found, its main street scarred by wagon ruts and old gunfire, its buildings leaning as if listening for trouble they already knew was coming. And when the townsfolk saw the lone rider approaching at a steady, unhurried pace, they did not feel hope so much as a dull curiosity, because men had come before claiming to bring order and had left quickly or not at all. Yet there was something different about Silas Boone, something in the way he sat his horse with quiet endurance rather than pride, the way his coat hung heavy with dust and memory, and the way the tarnished badge pinned to his chest caught the light only briefly, as if unsure it still belonged there. Silas had not planned to stop in Deadwood Crossing, had not planned to wear the badge again at all. But the road had a way of circling back on men who tried too hard to outrun themselves, and this town, lawless and afraid beneath its silence, felt like the last place a man like him would ever choose, which was precisely why fate brought him there. Years earlier, Silas Boone had been a marshal in another place, one that had believed in him until it didn't, a town that trusted him to stand between order and chaos, and he had failed them, not out of cowardice, but out of a single choice made too late, a hesitation born of mercy that had cost lives, including that of a young deputy who had looked at him with faith in his eyes right up until the end, and when the smoke cleared and the graves were filled, Silas had handed in his badge without being asked, carrying the weight of that failure like a second spine ever since. Deadwood Crossing knew nothing of this history, only that the gangs who ruled it by fear took notice immediately. Men like Rafe Calder, whose name was spoken only in half voices, a man who wore power easily and violence like a tool. And when Rafe heard that a marshal had ridden in and not yet ridden out, he laughed, because Deadwood Crossing broke men, it didn't redeem them. Silas rented a room above the old livery, paid in coin earned from jobs that required no questions, and spent his first nights listening to the sounds of the town, the sharp laughter from the saloon. The occasional gunshot meant more as warning than threat, and beneath it all, the quiet fear of people who had learned to endure rather than resist. And though he told himself he was only resting his horse, only passing through, his eyes kept drifting to the badge in the cracked mirror, the edges worn smooth by time and regret. It did not take long for trouble to come looking for him, because trouble always recognized men who still stood straight. And when a group of Calder's men shoved a shopkeeper into the street over a debt that had already been paid twice over, Silas found himself stepping forward before he could stop himself, his voice calm but firm as he told them to let the man go. And the street fell quiet in the way it does just before something breaks, and though Silas's hand hovered near his gun, it was not the threat that stopped them, but the certainty in his eyes, the sense that this was a man who understood the cost of drawing steel and would not flinch if it came to that. Word spread quickly after that, not because Silas wanted it to, but because Deadwood Crossing was starved for anything that wasn't fear, and people began to look at him differently, bringing him small offerings of gratitude he did not feel he deserved. Asking questions he answered carefully, because he knew better than anyone that hope could be a dangerous thing if raised too high. As the days passed, Silas learned the shape of the town's wounds, the families who stayed indoors after dark, the children who played quietly as if noise itself might invite harm, the way Calder's men collected loyalty through intimidation rather than respect, and each night, as Silas lay awake staring at the ceiling, he felt the ghosts of his past failure pressing closer, reminding him of what happened when a marshal misjudged the moment, when courage arrived a second too late. The town council, such as it was, approached him one evening in the back room of the church, asking him to wear the badge officially, to stand as marshal once more, and Silas listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, until they finished and the silence grew heavy, and when he finally spoke, he told them the truth, that he was not the hero they imagined, that he had failed before and could fail again, that wearing the badge did not make a man righteous, only responsible, and the oldest among them answered quietly that Deadwood Crossing did not need a perfect man, only one who would stay, and those words followed Silas long after he left the church, echoing louder than any praise ever had. He accepted the badge the next morning, not with ceremony but with a nod. And the town prepared for war whether it admitted it or not, because Calder would not tolerate a challenge to his rule, and as tensions rose, Silas walked the streets daily, speaking to people, setting small boundaries, pushing back where he could without lighting the fuse too soon, knowing full well that restraint was not the same as weakness, though the line between them was thin and unforgiving. Rafe Calder sent word soon enough, an invitation masked as a warning, asking Silas to meet him outside town at an abandoned freight yard, and Silas went alone, because some meetings could not be avoided or shared, and as he stood across from Calder amid rusted rails and long shadows, he saw in the other man a reflection of everything the West allowed when no one stood in its way, a confidence built on the certainty that no one would stop him, and when Calder mocked the badge, mocked Silas's past, speaking of failures he should not have known about, Silas felt the old guilt rise but did not let it sway him, answering only that Deadwood Crossing was done paying for Calder's freedom, and that whatever came next would be faced openly. The threat was clear, and when Silas returned to town, he began to prepare in earnest, organizing what few able-bodied men were willing to stand, teaching them not how to fight, but how to hold ground, how to look out for one another, because he knew that surviving violence was often about discipline more than bravery. The night before the expected clash, Silas walked alone to the edge of town, where the land fell away into darkness, and spoke aloud to the ghosts that followed him, admitting his fear, his doubt, his regret, but also his resolve, because this time, he would not wait for certainty before acting, and if Deadwood Crossing was to fall, it would not be because he hesitated again. Dawn came hard and bright, carrying with it the sound of approaching riders, and as the town braced itself, Silas stood in the middle of the street. Badge catching the light at last, not polished, not proud, but honest, a symbol worn by a man who had lost everything once and was willing to stand again anyway, and as the first shots rang out and the air filled with dust and shouting, Silas moved with steady purpose, not chasing glory but protecting ground, pulling people back from danger, making choices quickly and accepting their cost, and though the fight was fierce and uncertain, Deadwood Crossing did not break as it once would have. Because for the first time in years, it was not facing its fears alone. When the dust finally settled and the riders retreated, leaving silence and shaken relief behind, Silas remained standing, wounded but alive, feeling the weight of the badge not as punishment but as proof that redemption did not come from erasing the past, only from meeting it head-on, and as the townsfolk gathered around him, not cheering but grateful in the quiet way that mattered most, Silas Boone understood that he had not ridden into Deadwood Crossing to save it, but to finally forgive himself, even as the road ahead promised no rest, only the steady, difficult work of keeping the light burning in a place long accustomed to darkness. Deep in Black Canyon, where the rock walls rose like broken teeth and the sun seemed reluctant to linger, there was said to be a vein of gold so pure it shone even in darkness, a treasure whispered about in campfires and half-forgotten journals, always followed by the same warning, that it did not belong to men, but to something older, something patient, and it was this legend that found Thomas Reed on a night when desperation pressed harder than reason, when he sat alone in a dying mining camp with empty pockets, a tired mule, and a life that had narrowed to little more than survival. Thomas had not always been a prospector, but the West had a way of sanding people down until only need remained, and when an old map slipped from the lining of a dead man's coat during a game of cards gone quiet with unease, Thomas felt fate tighten its grip, because the map bore the crude mark of Black Canyon and a scrawled note that read only the gold listens, words he laughed at then, though the laughter died quickly in the still air. He told himself he did not believe in curses, only in hunger and chance, and by dawn he was riding east, the map folded carefully against his chest, the desert stretching wide and empty as if daring him to continue, and it was somewhere between the third day's heat and the fourth night's cold that the whispers began, not loud, not clear, but present, like wind brushing against thought, calling his name with a familiarity that unsettled him, promising relief from years of loss, a life unburdened by failure. If only he followed where the map led. Thomas tried to ignore them, blaming exhaustion, yet the voices seemed to know him, reminding him of debts unpaid, of a sister buried far from home, of the dream he once had of settling somewhere green and quiet. And with every mile closer to Black Canyon, the desert itself felt less empty. Shadows stretching longer than they should, his mule shying from rocks that seemed to shift when not directly watched, when at last the canyon opened before him, vast and silent beneath a sky bruised purple by dusk. Thomas felt awe and dread in equal measure, because the place felt aware of his presence, as though it had been waiting, and as he descended into its depths, the air cooled unnaturally, carrying the faint scent of iron and something older, something like smoke that never fully faded. The gold revealed itself gradually, not in glittering piles but in subtle gleams along the canyon walls, veins catching what little light reached them, and when Thomas touched the rock, warmth spread through his palm, followed by a whisper close enough to feel like breath, telling him that he had been chosen, that others had come before but lacked his resolve, and for a moment he believed it, because belief was easier than doubt when the promise was so close. He worked tirelessly, chipping away at the stone, filling his sacks until they grew heavy with more wealth than he had ever imagined, yet with each piece of gold taken, the canyon seemed to tighten, paths narrowing, echoes lingering too long, and the whispers growing more insistent, no longer asking but reminding him of the bargain he had not realized he was making, that nothing of value was ever freely given. Sleep became uneasy, filled with dreams of figures standing just beyond the firelight, watching without faces, and waking brought no relief, only the sense that time behaved differently here, days slipping past without clear count, his reflection in the water looking more hollow than before, as if the canyon were slowly learning his shape. Thomas told himself he would leave after one more day, one more sack, yet the map no longer pointed outward, its lines seeming to twist when he looked away, and when he finally loaded his mule and turned back toward the narrow trail, the canyon answered with a low rumble. Stones shifting to block his path, the whispers rising into a single voice that spoke not with anger but disappointment, reminding him that gold taken demanded something in return, not blood, not pain, but devotion, the quiet surrender of all roads that led away. Panic took hold then, and Thomas ran, abandoning sacks and tools, scrambling over rock and shadow, his heart pounding as the canyon seemed to breathe around him. Yet even as he fled, the voice softened, offering mercy if he would only listen, if he would stay and finish what he had begun. And in that moment Thomas understood the truth behind the legend, that the curse was not destruction but choice, the slow erasing of everything beyond desire. Exhausted and shaking, he collapsed at the canyon's edge as dawn broke pale and uncertain, and when he looked back, the gold no longer gleamed, the canyon appearing ordinary, silent, almost innocent, and for a long while he wondered if it had all been madness born of need, until he opened his hand and found a single nugget still warm against his skin, heavy with both promise and warning. Thomas left Black Canyon that morning poorer than he had arrived, yet somehow freer, because he had paid the price the canyon demanded by walking away, though the whispers never fully faded, returning in quiet moments to remind him of what he had refused, and in towns across the desert, his story would later be told in fragments, another caution added to the long memory of the West, that some gold listens, some places remember, and that the devil's bargain is rarely written in flame, but in the soft, tempting voice that knows exactly what a man is missing and asks only that he give up everything else.